Alcatraz Federal Penitentiary, built on an island in San Francisco Bay, was opened in 1934 to house America's most dangerous criminals. Built literally on an island surrounded by shark-infested waters, the prison was considered to be escape-proof, but that didn't keep the prisoners from attempting to escape from the infamous prison that was most awfully called simply the Rock. There were 14 escape attempts in the 29 years that the prison was in operation, and among those, one was particularly notable both for its daring and for its violence. The 1946 Battle of Alcatraz deserves to be remembered. 46-year-old Bernard Barney Coy had been convicted by a federal jury for robbing the Bank of New Haven, Kentucky in March of 1937. He and a cousin held a bank teller at gunpoint with a sawed-off shotgun, made off with $2,175. Sentenced to 25 years, he was transferred from Atlanta to Alcatraz in 1938. He had his troubles at Alcatraz. In 1938, he forfeited 100 days of statutory good time for fighting in an altercation where he received a minor stab wound. Nonetheless, Coy had, by 1946, earned the position of cell house orderly, a prison janitor, a position that allowed him relative access around the prison. From that position, he had observed lapses in the security of the notoriously strict prison that he thought he could exploit. And he became the ringleader of a group determined to escape the escape-proof prison. Coy had a plan to overwhelm one guard and gain access to a weapons locker, but he needed help to overwhelm another guard who he thought would have the keys that he needed to escape. It was a daring plan, and it required more men. His list of accomplices started with 33-year-old Marvin Franklin Hubbard. Hubbard was originally arrested for auto theft in Alabama, but in August of 1937 he escaped with 2 other prisoners and had taken a local police officer hostage, exacerbating the crime by carrying the officer across state lines to Tennessee. The officer had escaped and summoned a posse. Hubbard was wounded by the posse as he tried to escape. By 1946 he was serving a life sentence for armed robbery, kidnapping, stealing firearms, escaping from a county jail, and driving a stolen vehicle across a state line. He had been transferred to Alcatraz from Atlanta in 1944 for his role in a prison riot. At Alcatraz, he was a kitchen orderly, and late cleanup in the prison kitchen made him a crucial part of Coy's plan. But Coy figured that he would also need some muscle for his plan to work, and so he recruited some other prisoners to his plan. 29-year-old Miran Buddy Thompson was an armed robber who showed skill at both getting caught and at escaping. He had been arrested 8 times and escaped 8 times from small jails. In March of 1945, he was arrested by an Amarillo, Texas police detective. Thompson had hidden a gun and shot the detective. He then kidnapped 3 other people while making his escape. He had been given a life sentence for the murder of the detective, plus 99 years for the kidnapping, and due to his record of escapes, was sent to Alcatraz. Clarence Carnes was just 19 years old, the youngest man in Alcatraz. A Choctaw from Oklahoma, he was known as the Choctaw Kid. He had been given a life sentence at just the age of 16 after killing a garage attendant during an attempted holdup. He escaped from a reformatory, in the course of which he took a hostage, adding 99 years to his life sentence for kidnapping. He was then sent to Leavenworth Federal Penitentiary, but after another escape attempt, to Alcatraz. A 1945 psychiatric report said of him, "Judgment very faulty, and he seems to act wholly on impulse without any attempt to reason things out beforehand, and impulsive and aggressive and heedless of the rights of others." 35-year-old Dutch Kretzer had done his first stint in prison at the age of 16. In the 1930s, he had been part of a gang of West Coast bank robbers called the Kretzer-Kyle Gang that had earned him a spot as number 4 on the FBI Most Wanted list. He had been finally run down by federal agents in 1939 and had pled guilty to one of the bank robberies. He was given a sentence of 25 years and sent to McNeil Island Federal Penitentiary, where he tried to escape. While being tried for the crime of escape, he and an accomplice assaulted a U.S. Marshal in another escape attempt. The Marshal died of a heart attack, leaving Kretzer with a life sentence and a ticket to Alcatraz. Kretzer then demanded that another prisoner, a friend of his, be included. 37-year-old Sam Shockley had been sentenced to life imprisonment for bank robbery and kidnapping. Sent to the federal penitentiary at Leavenworth, he was found to have an IQ of just 54 and be prone to violent outbursts and an unstable personality. He had been sent to Alcatraz because it was thought that the more strict prison routine would help to manage his unstable personality. He had befriended Joe Kretzer when the two had made a failed escape attempt from one of the prison workshops in 1941. Coy's plan started with guard Bert Birch. Birch patrolled an elevated gun platform that overlooked the C&D blocks. Birch was armed with a Springfield rifle and a .45 caliber pistol. But Birch had a routine so precise it could be timed. He would leave the C block for a few minutes at specific times and then go look over D block. That meant that there were a few minutes when C block was not observed. Coy had fabricated a bar spreader, a device that would push two bars apart by turning a screw with a pair of pliers. His plan was to use the time when Birch went to D block to strip off his clothes, shimmy up the bars, use the bar spreader to make a gap big enough to slip through, and waylay Birch as he came back in, taking his guns and getting access to D block to release his co-conspirators. Coy had been starving himself for weeks in order to make it easier to slip through the gap in the bars. But he also needed to waylay guard William Miller, who watched the C block door, because Miller had a key to the prison yard. By prison rules, he wasn't supposed to keep the key, but pass it to the guard in the gun cage every time he used it. That was intended to make it impossible for the prisoners to take the key that would let them out into the yard, exactly what Coy hoped to do. But Coy noticed that Miller often did not follow the rule, because keeping the key allowed him to let out the kitchen staff without disturbing the gallery guard during lunch. As Hubbard worked in the kitchen, he would have to overpower Miller when he let him out of the kitchen, thus getting the key that Coy hoped would allow them to escape the yard and get to the prison dock, where, using the guns from the locker, they would hijack the boat that carried supplies to the prison and make their escape. It was a convoluted plan, and much could go wrong, but men serving life sentences are desperate men. They made their move on May 2nd, 1946. Coy was in the main block, sweeping up. When Miller opened the door to let Hubbard out, having finished his kitchen duties, he and Coy jumped Miller, clubbing him over the head. Miller had no gun, but he did have a gas billy, a billy club that could also dispense tear gas. They threw Miller in a cell. They then hurried to where they had stashed the bar spreader and pliers. When Birch made his normal trip to D block, Coy managed to strip down, shimmy up the bars, and use the bar spreader to make a gap wide enough to slip into the gun gallery. Coy attacked Birch immediately as he opened the door. Caught by surprise, Birch was quickly subdued. Coy yanked the rifle from his hands and beat him unconscious with it. The plan was working so far. Coy went along to the gun gallery to D block and threatened guard Cecil Corwin with his rifle. He forced Corwin to open the door to the main block, letting in Carnes, Hubbard, and Kretzer. They then opened the D block doors and freed Thompson and Shockley. They hoped to free another conspirator, but he was in a restricted cell, and opening it would have triggered an alarm, so they left him behind. Other D block prisoners were also released, but they wisely decided to stay in their cells. The prisoners were convinced their desperate plan was working, but in fact, it was already doomed. Guard Miller had figured out what they wanted and had managed to slip the key to the cell yard off the ring and hide it. The gang had no way to get out of the cell block. Coy started desperately trying every key they had taken from the guards. It was useless. Not only had Miller hidden the correct key, but the locks were designed to prevent exactly what Coy was trying. If too many of the wrong keys were tried, the lock would freeze, and no key would work. The escape attempt had failed. Now it was a hostage situation. The group slowly waylaid other guards as they came in for regular duties or were sent to check on the other missing guards. Eventually, they had 9 guards stashed in 2 cells. But prison authorities were now well aware of what was going on. The group decided that if there was no means for escape, they would go down fighting. They started taking pot shots at guards in the towers. They didn't hit any of them, but one of the guards was injured with fragments from a bullet that shattered against a steel bar and struck his legs. The groups started arguing with the guards that they had waylaid. When one of the officers told them they had no chance of escape and would die if they tried, Kretzer told them that the guards would die as well. He shot into the cell. Then Shockley yelled to kill all the hostages, saying they wouldn't have anyone to testify against them. Kretzer emptied the .45 into the 2 cells. 6 of the officers were injured. Officer Bill Miller later died of his wounds. The guards, playing dead, were terrified that Kretzer would come in and finish the job, but he walked away. Desperately, one of the guards managed to write the names of the 6 prisoners involved on a cell wall. Warden James Johnson sent in a large and heavily armed force in the afternoon. They managed to drive the prisoners back and rescue the hostages, but a second guard, Harold Stiles, was killed and 3 more wounded in the melee. The warden now shut off the power and water to the block, which was surrounded with floodlights and wailing sirens. Guards shot tear gas through the windows to keep the men pinned down. Carnes, Shockley, and Thompson decided the jig was up and went back to their cells, hoping their involvement would be missed. But Coy, Hubbard, and Kretzer decided to fight to the death. Then Johnston took it up a notch and called in the United States Marine Corps. The Marines used tactics developed in the Pacific against Japanese soldiers in bunkers, drilling holes in the roof and dropping in hand grenades to drive the prisoners to a spot where they could be captured. 3 boxes of rifle grenades and 150 hand grenades later, the 3 prisoners found a phone and called asking about terms for surrender. Johnston told them that the only terms would be to throw out their guns and give up. When a guard peeked into C block, they shot at him. That was their answer to the warden's demand for surrender. The following morning, Marines carefully peered in through a window and saw nothing. A guard fired a shot into C block to see if there was a response. None came. Guards moved in and fired a dozen shots into the utility corridor where the three were thought to be hiding. In response, they heard 3 shots. They were the last shots of the Battle of Alcatraz. Coy, Hubbard, and Kretzer had chosen suicide over capture. In an odd twist, Marvin Hubbard had filed an appeal to his conviction, and the hearing for that appeal was held the Monday after he had committed suicide. A prosecutor in the case said that Hubbard had a fair chance that his conviction would be overturned. Clarence Carnes, Myron Thompson, and Sam Shockley had gone back to their cells, hoping to remain anonymous. Their hope was that Kretzer had killed the hostages who could identify them as being part of the attempt. But all but one of the hostages had survived. The 3 were quickly identified, tried for their roles in the escape attempt, and sentenced to death. Thompson and Shockley were executed in the gas chamber of nearby San Quentin Prison on December 3rd, 1948. A judge found sympathy for Clarence Carnes owing to his age and the fact that the hostages reported that at one point he had refused an order by Kretzer to shoot them. His death sentence was commuted, but another life sentence was added to his term. Despite that, he did manage to eventually earn release in 1973, but he couldn't make it on the outside and violated the terms of his parole. He died in 1988 in the federal penitentiary in Springfield, Missouri. Alcatraz prison would see several more escape attempts, including the famous incident in June of 1962, where prisoners Frank Morris and brothers John and Clarence Anglin escaped and were never found. Alcatraz Federal Penitentiary closed March 21, 1963. The buildings were simply rotting due to all the exposure to the salt air, and it was too expensive to repair what was already the most expensive prison in the federal system to operate. The former prison was turned into a tourist attraction, and today attracts more than 1.5 million visitors a year. I hope you enjoyed this episode of The History Guy, short snippets of forgotten history between 10 and 15 minutes long. And if you did enjoy, please go ahead and click that thumbs up button. If you have any questions or comments or suggestions for future episodes, please write those in the comment section. I will be happy to personally respond. Be sure to follow The History Guy on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, and check out our merchandise on teespring.com. And if you'd like more episodes on forgotten history, all you need to do is subscribe.